She stood outside a courthouse that no longer pretended to be grand. Bomb scars still in the cornices, glass replaced by plywood, a coat of post-war dust that made even uniforms look tired, and listened to a clerk mispronounce her famous last name. 4 years earlier, a car like a drawing room had delivered her past guards, who saluted the name. In 1946, a tram groaned, and a stranger offered her a seat because he didn't recognize her. The women who had once lived behind guarded doors were learning the arithmetic of ordinary life. The Reich was gone, its palaces diluted into rubble and requisition, and the wives and mistresses who had orbited power moved in lines with everyone else, to registration offices, to internment camps, to interview rooms where pencils wrote faster than memories, to denazification panels where strangers measured a life in categories: major offender, offender, lesser, follower, exonerated, as if a wedding photograph could be laid flat on a scale and weighed against everything that had followed. They were called Nazi princesses by newspapers that liked a headline that sold and a shorthand that condemned. The files would tell slower stories of seizure lists and medical reports, interrogations and appeals, children shuffled from household to household, stigma that outlived ration cards. History remembers the men by rank and death. It remembers these women by long afterlives that looked like administrivia, but felt like sentence. Emmy Göring, born Sonnemann, walked through rooms where microphones once waited for her applause, and instead heard her name called for questioning, her stage career replaced by a docket number. Gretl Braun, the youngest in a family that spent the last days of the Reich in a bunker under a city learning how a map can burn, sat next to a pram and signed forms with a married name that had become a liability overnight. Gerda Bormann, her letters brittle with ideology and motherhood both, went south as the front closed, thin with illness and stubborn with certainties that did not keep her warm. Margarete Himmler, precise and provincial in the way that makes a household run, met a world that refused to believe she had organized only linen cupboards and school books. Some figures were already beyond law. Eva Braun's last hours ended in a room that would later belong to legend. Magda Goebbels made a choice with ampules and a mother's hands that newspapers would try and fail to turn into sense. The rest, Ilse Hess, Lina Heydrich, Henriette von Schirach, Margarete Speer, and others who had worn titles like furniture, learned that proximity to power turns into a ledger when power is gone. The ledger opened with arrests. MPs and Soviet patrols and local police, sometimes in borrowed boots, knocked on doors that had been bourgeois a month earlier and state property by the weekend. Papers, please. A suitcase, if you like. A child may bring a coat. The house will be sealed. The keys will be kept. You may list what you claim to own. The list will live in a file that will outlive your furniture. Camp gates closed behind women who had been dressed by dressmakers, now wearing utility cloth and sleeves that remembered ironing boards they had never met. The interrogations began in rooms where the windows preferred to stay open because the air preferred to be cold. Translators sat between questions and answers like careful bridges. Recorders typed with war tempo. Did you know? What did you know? When did you know? Whom did you meet? Where did the money come from? The answers were rehearsals of a stance. I did not know, I was at home, I kept my head down, I watched the pantry, I raised children, I visited the Red Cross, I sent parcels, I asked no questions because the world had no room for questions in those years. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was a story grown around truths that had to be admitted without being owned. Denazification, a word that sounds efficient and felt messy, put categories where lives used to be. Spruchkammern, tribunals staffed by judges who had learned to be new, read dossiers thicker than winter bread. Photographs of parties and uniforms, bank accounts that had swollen in the good years and deflated with the currency reform, affidavits from neighbors who had learned the courage to testify when courage no longer cost a night visit. The panels levied bans from public work and fines that assumed a bank balance that had been confiscated already. They barred women from stages and schools, from microphones and magazines, from the right to live in cities where their names had once opened doors. Officials called it re-education, critics called it theater, petitioners called it luck. In the files, you can hear the scrape of categories against edges that do not fit. A widow asks for a permit to move to a smaller flat. A mother applies for milk rations for a child whose father was famous enough to make neighbors curious. A sister asks whether a grave can be visited without the police demanding an explanation for grief. Public headlines preferred punctuation. Göring's wife questioned, a metal stamp sentence that cut, Braun's sister Zine in Innsbruck, a photograph that pretended to be glimpsed rather than posed. Himmler's family interned, a chorus of articles that used the plural to avoid the intimacy of naming the child who now needed shoes. Behind the punctuation were rooms where women met a strange silence. Old friends changed sidewalks. Shopkeepers suddenly remembered unpaid tabs. Cities remembered possessions that had sat too long in homes that did not earn them. In that silence, the private costs accumulated. There were guardianship disputes over children who had inherited more rumor than money. There were confiscated homes that insisted on being drafty after Allied officers left them with less care than the previous servants had applied. There were illnesses diagnosed as nervous, which is the phrase a post-war doctor uses when the vocabulary of trauma has not yet been printed in the new textbooks. It is possible, in files that are not about law, to watch a person become smaller because that is how you survive a crowd that used to applaud your hat. We set the record straight because records survive when dignity does not. Eva Braun, a name too often used as shorthand for a rumor, spent her last hours doing the domestic in a room that had become a bunker, handing out provisions, throwing a small wedding party in a place where no one had the appetite for cake, choosing a dress that would look like loyalty on a day when loyalty failed the city, then swallowing a capsule while an empire folded itself into smoke. There was no escape attempt, no fashion gesture as myth likes to invent. There was a will written in neat prose and a stubborn insistence that her dogs not suffer the ending she was choosing. Magda Goebbels, whose letters earlier in the war can sound like orthodoxy practiced as devotion, poisoned her 6 children in a Berlin where all futures had been mortgaged to a present tense that refused to end any other way. The murder-suicide is a story that historians tell without adjectives because adjectives belong to people who can sleep. On the other side of those deaths were women who had wanted a different ending and got the one the world had written. Ilse Hess would conduct a decades-long campaign to bring her husband home from the Spandau cell that learned to echo. Lina Heydrich would defend a man history calls architect of murder and run a guest house as if running a household could undo a map. Gerda Bormann would die not in the photo albums, but in a mountain town, tightening her grip on convictions as the world loosened its grip on her. Every story in this ledger is 2 columns: what the state did and what it felt like. The state seized property with forms that looked clinical and usually were. The cupboards emptied, the paintings disappeared into repositories where clerks numbered a nation's bad taste, and the accounts that had been padded by contracts and gifts fluttered into bankruptcy under a new currency's superior morality. The feeling was older than law. Humiliation, the shock of being a face no one greeted, the speed with which children learned to answer a birth name with a new one to avoid stares in a schoolyard that had not yet learned to share sympathy. Banished from cities by residency decrees, a few of the women retreated to rural addresses with cousins who were generous for 6 months and then practical afterward. Some applied for new work and found that employers preferred anonymous competence to famous last names. Others discovered that the only work offered to them was the work they had always outsourced, and they learned to carry coal and peel potatoes with a seriousness that would have been a novelty and was now a merit. And yet, for all the symmetry of the newspaper nickname, their fates diverged. Some received prison terms after conventional trials for fraud or for an ownership that could not be explained without admitting the source of the furniture. Others faced bans. No stage, no public employment, no paper will print your name except in the crime column, with expiration dates measured in years that would feel like decades because loneliness changes the hour hand. Some were exiled within their own country. By law, you could not see. Residency restrictions that made cities off-limits, zones of civic shame defined by checkpoints and notice boards, and settled into caution as a virtue. A few were cautiously rehabilitated because the new administration needed people who knew how papers move from desk to desk. Attempts at reinvention arrived. A memoir, a boutique with a breathy name, a claim to have criticized a leader in private that sometimes turned out to be true and was punished for being private. Not redemption. History owns that word. But the neighborly permissions that mean a life can proceed without the police. The children bore the longest burden. You can follow it in school records that once pretended to be apolitical and now resembled dossiers. A teacher noted a child's sudden absences after a classmate repeated a rumor overheard at home. A headmaster wrote gently to a mother that the fees were late and unsustainable, but also wrote to the police that he feared a protest if the child were allowed to return. Names were changed or hyphenated into safety. Guardianship disputes crawled through courts too crowded for patience. Grandparents petitioned to adopt grandchildren so the municipal office would stamp good on the household. Orphanage records listed birthdays next to parent names that made inspectors adjust their tone. The burden did not file itself away when ration cards ended. It became a habit. Adult lives built on that habit often grew barbed wire around dinner tables. Do not ask, do not tell, do not bring papers into the house, do not correct a neighbor when they pretend not to know. A few children reclaimed their surnames and their biographies with a courage that came across as arrogance to people who had not carried the weight. A few never spoke. Most compromised with time by calling the past complicated and the present necessary. Emmy Göring's case looked, at first glance, like a simple calculation applied to a famous life. Born to the stage, she had married a man who made uniforms into costumes and a country into a theater where his entrances mattered more than exits. The denazification file acted as a stage manager, too. It listed the addresses where she'd lived, the contracts she'd signed, the gifts delivered to her by a husband whose idea of giving was measured in carats and hectares. The panel wanted receipts. She offered letters. The record of her interrogation reads like a script of 2 plays, one performed for the tribunal, one performed for herself. Yes, she had hosted. No, she had not chosen the guest list. Yes, she had benefited. No, she had not asked where the wealth came from, because a wife asks different questions when a country applauds a husband. The court banned her from the stage and assessed fines that turned the private wardrobes of the old regime into public revenue. Property seizures humiliated in the ordinary ways, catalog lists that reduced memory to inventory numbers, officials in boots walking through rooms where servants used to walk, and then ended in the ordinary way. The state stopped when rooms were bare enough. Years later, cautiously, she would find work again, a bright shadow on a regional stage where applause now measured craft instead of proximity. If her daughter was sometimes asked in schoolyards whether diamonds had been normal in her nursery, the files do not say how often. They record instead that the mother learned to bring a modest handbag to the tram stop. Gretl Braun's file runs thin and sharp, like a rail in winter. She spent the war's last week with a new husband whose execution in April 1945 erased not just a future, but an explanation. When she sat in interview rooms and told interrogators that she had not planned a political career but had inherited a catastrophe, the clerks wrote down names and dates and the absence that grew where a husband should have been. The edge of her record is domestic and tender. A child born into a country that had just started calling names evidence. The baby named for a woman whose last hours would only become fully legible when the bunker files and recollections congealed years later. Gretl moved where she was allowed, which was not always where she needed to be, and portals that had opened cheaply in 1943 now required permissions that had to be renewed in triplicate. Money came slowly and then ran out. She remarried much later, like a person who learned to say no to romances that required perpetual apologies. She did not write a memoir. She learned instead to be less visible than the legends that borrowed her family name and turned her sister's photograph into a postcard of the Third Reich's faded glamour. In the private ledger, the cost was measured in precautions, teaching a daughter to read gossip without keeping it, avoiding rooms where veterans argued, choosing friends who kept her house as a place where the past did not get to sit at the table uninvited. Gerda Bormann's trajectory is an old Europe story, conviction ahead of comfort, inflexible piety paired with a practicality that ran households like a garrison. She fled south as the war in Germany turned into a geography of certainties gone wrong, carrying children, letters, and a devotion that had not learned to absorb contradiction. The records follow her into the Alps, then to Italian addresses that sound like postcards and felt like convalescence wards. Illness, recorded in a doctor's hand that tries to be precise without being cruel, narrowed the end of a life that had once expanded into arguments about ideology over coffee in quarters that had been tested by servants. Internment and interrogations found her briefly, but the wider mechanisms of denazification had little time for someone who did not outlive her convictions by very long. For the children, the state's substitute for a mother was bureaucracy, designed to be fair and incapable of kindness. Guardianship decisions layered authority on top of family sentiment. The Bormann name made officials thorough because thoroughness is how an office tells itself it has been brave without being reckless. Later, when confirmation of Martin Bormann's fate finally stiffened into scientific proof, the file acquired a postscript tone, closure created by forensic work that also reopened wounds. The photographs of the children taken in the early 1950s show careful haircuts and eyes that look at a future without offering any of it to the camera. Margarete Himmler, Marga in letters that swing between schoolteacher briskness and a householder's meticulous worry, was interned with the precision of someone who had always kept calendars. She faced questions that tried to square the circle of a wife who enjoyed the status of a Reichsführer's household, and a woman who claimed to have stayed out of the rooms where decisions landed like sentences. The panel's categories offered her a narrow path. Not innocent, not architect, perhaps complicit in a way that is hard to map with a pencil. Denazification judgments over the years placed some wives in followers or lesser offenders, a placement that masked more than it revealed. The important effect was banishment from public work and a relocation to addresses that did not carry the balm of anonymity because the postman still knew the name on the envelope. Her daughter, Gudrun, stubborn and certain, bore the weight differently, absolutely, publicly, and attached herself to circles after the war that offered loyalty to a memory that most of a country was trying to fold into archives. The private records of the Himmler household, seized letters about schoolwork, recipes, domestic quarrels, sit today in boxes that force historians to read the everyday and admit its complicity. That a cake recipe can live on the back of a letter that asked for a meeting where a crime was planned. One does not redeem the other. Together they describe a life lived while history sharpened its knife in the next room. Ilse Hess made loyalty an occupation. When her husband flew to Scotland in 1941, and the Reich pretended that defection was madness, and then pretended madness was loyalty, she raised a son with a conviction that a man's singular act could be interpreted into something that deserved return rather than punishment. After 1945, her campaign to bring Rudolf Hess home became a long corridor lined with petitions. She visited offices that treated her politely and sent her away gently, and did so for decades. In that corridor you can hear the clack of dozens of stamps pressing dates into paper, the sigh of officials who knew the rules and could not make them exceptions for a family story, and the stubborn patience of a woman who believed that memory was a tool the state had misused. Her denazification panel's outcome, restrictions that barred public work for a time, watch lists that made border crossings into small dramas, did not end her advocacy. In the private mathematics of her life, the campaign became its own purpose. The son grew up under an inheritance that was an address more than a bank account, a visit to a prison that stood for an argument older than he was. Ilse's letters have the tone of a person who knows the answer and keeps asking anyway, because asking has become the way the day passes. Lina Heydrich went north and made a business out of stubbornness. On a Baltic island, She ran a guest house with a precision that frightened guests into behaving on time. When officials came to question her, she defended a dead husband with a discipline that made stenographers underline adjectives. Her denazification process is an example of what tribunals sometimes produced when a life could not be convincingly turned into a category: a suspended sentence of reputational exile. It did not imprison her. It did not welcome her either. She published memoirs that defended more than they confessed, and she raised children in a landscape where summer tourists had no idea that the woman arranging the linen had once signed letters at a desk furnished by a regime that used office furniture to plan calamity. Some neighbors were kind because islands teach kindness as technology. Others were exacting because the headlines had taught them to be. In her older years, interviews show a woman who believed that explanation could serve as contour without shading. Historians will reject that belief. Records tolerate it and do not bow. Her legacy to her children was a name that closed some doors and opened only those favored by people who desired the thrill of suspended judgment. Henriette von Schirach's turn is softer in the files and sharper in recollections. Married to the head of a youth organization that tried to make identity a uniform, she enjoyed the culture that came with being in the center lane of a parade state. Art, galleries, dinners where everyone tried to be seen thinking. She reportedly once raised a mild protest about the treatment of Jews to a leader who did not enjoy being contradicted. The protest, an act minor in cost and major in imagination within that circle, produced social frost and perhaps saved her from later categorizations as severe as they might have been. Denazification judged her for membership and public role. She accepted restrictions and suffered exiles of invitation rather than geography. In later years, she cultivated a seriousness that sounded like repentance, and sometimes like pride in being the sort of person who could have repented. The diaries and letters she left behind show the half-light of someone learning that taste without ethics is just another uniform. Her children, one does not name them here because they tried to live privately, wrote less. Their files contain schools, moves, a few appeals for scholarships, and short notes of thanks to administrators who treated them as individual students rather than chapters in a book about their parents. Margaret Speer's life was entwined with a man who made a public confession into a career and turned a prison term into a writing schedule. Her correspondence and denazification file are smaller than his and teach a complementary lesson. That one person's attempt at moral accounting does not remove the arithmetic from the household ledger. She faced seizures and restrictions quietly. She kept a family together through years spent visiting a husband who became an author of contrition and an exhibit in debates about sincerity. When he came home, she had to learn to share a living room with publishers and the sound of a typewriter that manufactured reputation. The children grew into an arrangement with their father's history that asked them to be curators and critics at once. In private papers, there are lists of shopping, recipes, train times, and notes about a plumber. It is fashionable to fret at such ordinariness and to demand the dramatic admission that many hoped for and did not get. The truth is that the ordinary is where the long sentences are served. You live quietly with a past that makes noise outside the house and try to mute it at the dinner table without erasing it from the bookshelf. Magda Goebbels deserves a paragraph that declines to be theatrical, because the act that ended her life was theatrical enough to poison the language around it. She killed 6 children in a bunker where the future had already been sacrificed, then killed herself. In files, there are inventories of the children's clothes and toys, as if the law, unable to prosecute the dead, could at least notarize what innocence had owned. Joseph Goebbels wrote notes that sound like a man composing an ending no one would be allowed to edit. The rest of Germany read rumors that ran faster than funerals. For years afterward, women who lived near the families of those children winced when their own children laughed too freely in the street. The presence of that story in this ledger changes the tone of every mild case. It is the weight that drags light sentences into seriousness, the reminder that the category of wife and mother cannot be used as absolution when power teaches people to think of children as property. It should not be compared to the rehabilitation of a minor propagandist's spouse or the careful, slow reintegration of an actress with a history. It is its own black square on the page. History can do as much. Insist on separation. Demand we not call everything complicated when some things are simple and monstrous. There were women the headlines barely named who nonetheless lived under the same ledger. Secretaries promoted into intimacy, mistresses regularized into wives by ceremony in rooms with flags, provincial girls who learned the choreography of Berlin and then forgot it to survive the choreography of post-war paperwork. Many of them moved through the same stations: internment, interrogation, release, denazification, appeal, the slow economy of social permission. Regional exile meant asking permission to live within certain kilometers of cities that could have offered work. Bans from public employment meant discovering private markets that had no room for last names that made customers stare. Property seizures meant moving to rooms that did not remember carpets. Some women found cautious rehabilitation in the 1950s, not because the state forgot, but because the state needed a way to keep order without inventing an underclass of permanent pariahs. They returned to clerical work, to teaching under supervision, to the arts under conditions, to private enterprise under scrutiny that became indifference over time. Others became housekeepers of silence. They kept the names, kept the photographs hidden, kept the stories short, kept the friends few, kept birthdays quiet, kept weddings private, kept the past in a cupboard no visitor was allowed to open. Their children inherited the key without wanting it. Beyond Europe, these stories traveled in thin envelopes to South America, to the Canary Islands, to neutral countries that had spent the war measuring their neutrality with a ruler and a mirror. A few families attempted reinvention abroad. Some built quiet franchises on tourist coasts where Germans came to forget winter, and a phrase like "former times" could be uttered in a voice that sounded like weather. The paperwork followed. Extradition requests, denied for reasons both legal and convenient, asset freezes that turned hotel nights into legal arguments, immigration forms that asked politely about affiliations and heard answers that were, equally politely, lies of omission. For others, exile was internal but complete. A village that chose to be kind because the war had already taken enough unkindness out of all of them. A church that preferred penance done by sweeping stone floors to penance done by speaking to reporters. A cemetery where a name on a stone was an act of courage and sometimes of provocation. In those places, their lives reduced to the same small economies that saved everyone else, good bread, repaired roofs, a doctor who knew when to write nerves and when to write rest, a shopkeeper who pretended not to notice the name on a ration card, a neighbor who offered a cup of sugar because the street had decided it would be decent again. What remains at the end of the files is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains at the end of the files is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed. Some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades, the slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed. Some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed. Some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility. What remains, at the end of the files, is not a verdict that fits on a placard, but a practice that lasted decades. The slow work of accountability applied to the margins of power. Denazification was a grammar, imperfect, revised in use, contradictory in places, that allowed a society to speak about guilt without turning every conversation into a shout. The women once called Nazi princesses learned to live under that grammar. Some exploited its loopholes, some resisted, some obeyed, Some suffered more than the law required, and others less than a moralist would have demanded. Their children learned a second language, how to be themselves while being reminders. The houses were smaller, the rooms colder, the dinners quieter, the laughter careful, the future a bargain struck with neighbors. And yet there was a future, which is the only mercy the 20th century allowed with any consistency. A ledger closed, another opened, and in that accounting a continent learned, clumsily, that proximity to power is itself a responsibility.